Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody to this, the second panel of the Reimagining Climate Adaptation Summit. It's lovely to know that there are so many people here. We've had reports of the numbers from this morning. So I hope a number of you were at this morning's session, because this session really flows very neatly from this morning's. I'm Christine Winter. I'm from the University of Sydney, where I'm a postdoctoral researcher with the Sydney Environment Institute, a position I feel very honoured to hold. And I'm also a lecturer with the Department of Government and International Relations. And as you may gather, I am a settler here in Australia. I live and I work on unceded Gadigal lands. I pay my respects to the Gadigal elders, past and present, and I feel constantly present to two things. One is the care that Gadigal have for country and have expressed for country for generations. And secondly, I'm very present to the fact that the asphalt in the buildings of Sydney are sort of an act of erasure of that care, not sort of, desperate, definitely an act of erasure. So I'm constant to that constantly. I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I have Ngāti Pākehā or European and Ngāti Kahungunu heritage. The point of our session today is to expand the conversation out into the Pacific, so beyond the reach of Australia and the Torres Strait Islands where we started this morning. And so we have representation from the Marshall Islands, again from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and from Kiribati and the Solomon Islands. And I'll tell you a little bit more about each presenter, Mark Stege, Meg Parsons and Tammy Tabe, as I introduce them. So they'll be sharing their personal experiences of implementing adaptation strategies in their own countries or in their own regions, and continuing the themes of both Bruce's keynote and the last panel from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islands, where they'll be focusing, as it were, on the importance of integrating Indigenous knowledge into adaptation planning, and importantly demonstrating what contribution Indigenous knowledge had already to adaptation. So there are a couple of key questions for the session. The first is, what is at stake for Pacific Island nations in a warming climate? And I think a lot of us are aware that it really is an existential threat. It's a threat not only to people but to culture. And secondly, the second question is, how can we learn from and implement Indigenous knowledge in adaptation policies and strategies? So speaking in order, we have Mark, then Meg, followed by Tammy, and each will reflect for about 10 minutes. And then after that, we have a Q&A discussion between me and the speakers before we open the floor for audience questions. So please put your questions into the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll collate those. We have a wonderful team behind the scenes, and particularly we have Genevieve Wright, who will be working very busily collating the questions for us, so that I will be to some extent less frazzled than I would otherwise by the questions coming in. So there'll be time for you to question at the end. Please keep those questions rolling in as they occur to you, and we'll come to them. So thank you, and let's get started with the real speakers, not with me. I'm sure you're sick of me already. So our first speaker is Mark Stege. Mark grew up in the Marshall Islands and in the United States, and he studied Pacific Island history, organisational management and climate change at a bunch of different universities. He presently works as a researcher and a consultant based in Majuro. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Mark. You can correct it later if you like. Much of his research is in climate-induced migration. And that's a theme that's going to come through in Tammy's presentation as well. So his research is on climate-induced migration, and it revolves around themes of community-based ecosystems and related natural, social, and infrastructure systems to improve and prolong the livability of place in atoll communities. Oftentimes these efforts, says Mark, align with his duties as an elected official for Malelap atoll. Again, Mark, my apologies, I've just mutilated that. One of the 24 rural municipalities in the Marshall Islands. He serves on several regional and national boards and steering committees in government, utilities, education, and the private sector. Mark, kia ora, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Christine. Yahweh, Aulip, Jen Majerum, Jen Majal, Adain Mark Stege, Alawa Mananain, join the Rainy Bemiwood. Special thank you to Dr. John Barnett, who was very instrumental in allowing me to join you today. So thank you, John, for that too. It is an honor to be here, and I'll just get started so that we can maximize our time together. As was mentioned earlier, I'm from Malolap Atoll local government. Malolap means large lagoon in the Marshallese language. There are many atolls throughout the Pacific and even in the Indian Ocean. Quite a few that are circled here in red. The Marshalls are located right here in the top left corner. There are 29 atolls, and in fact 5 raised atoll islands which do not have an enclosed lagoon. And interestingly, these raised structures without an enclosed lagoon tend to feature some of our highest elevation points in the Marshall Islands. There are quite a few atoll societies as well. We'll just limit them to the atoll nations. There are 4, as we all know, and there's quite a variety amongst them. So this table here is just intended to highlight that variety and the specific needs and contexts of the people that are adapting to climate change, often in very similar ways, but with very different tool sets and ways of communication, etc. I find this poem always an interesting thing to add to my talk. So it speaks to how things are changing. The time has come, the island said, to speak of many things, of basic needs, of times gone by and what the future brings, and why our seas are rising high and what these things might mean. So it's a reflection that I often find myself reflecting on and trying to understand how the ecosystems are changing and what that change means. So it's there's quite a few meanings behind that change, and I just like using that, so I'm going to add that whenever I can. But I think if you get to the technical side of what is very much an emotional process for atoll societies, losing your home is not in anyone's imagination. It's like a fire. Just losing everything is just so traumatic. But trying to, from my standpoint as an atoll elected member of our council, with constituents who I am responsible to and taking care of their best interests, it sometimes helps if I can kind of think of tipping points or thresholds, which decisions need to be made. And some people I gathered here today have often used the term adaptation pathway. I think it's very similar, and the process of identifying that pathway and self-determining the tipping points and thresholds is essentially what I think is in the best interests of what we can make the most out of a very difficult situation. Self-determining and being empowered by those decisions in what will very much be a often disempowering scenario where we are, facing the types of threats that, like I said, can be comparable to your house being on fire. And this is the kind of emotional situation that we find ourselves. I think finding the opportunities to make these self-determinations of what those thresholds are and what those tipping points might be are very important. Also important, and what is really the focus of my talk today, are the tools and skill sets that are often used when you can attempt to quantify or develop metrics around those tipping points. Giving them the ability to be known specific points in time or place where that occurs. The tools and the skill sets necessary for that are very important. So I'm going to be focusing today on just really two. I think I have enough time to quickly play you a video. But first, this one is just briefly, I'll just mention it. This is something that I'm looking at, groundwater monitoring with a focus on salinity levels at the household level. So very quickly, if everyone can see this, I'm looking at essentially, three-step process. And in all three steps, local agency is highlighted in blue. It's not just what you do, it's how you do it. And it's really important that in addition to following some very specific and defendable methodology for groundwater monitoring of salinity levels, that you integrate into that process a lot of local agency. And that's essentially what this is supposed to show, is that there are specific parameters that we are going to be inventorying to determine the condition or the type of material or just the name of the village that the groundwater falls within. And then training some youth monitoring team members to measure the salinity levels at those points, and then using the data that they have collected to develop mapping products. So it seems very straightforward and obvious, but it seems like most of the time the blue section is externalized. A lot of that work or a lot of that expertise is externalized. And it's really undercutting a lot of the adaptation responses that I think are possible. And I think I really want to highlight today. So just highlighting again in blue, there's always opportunity to get locals involved in the work, the scientific method that is being deployed. No matter what the threshold or tipping point may be, always look for ways to integrate with the community, not just in participation after the data has been gathered and analyzed, but in actually gathering and analyzing that data. It's very powerful, and it's something that I'm hoping that this project here on Madro with groundwater monitoring will allow us to pilot and to show that it's possible to do it this way. One other thing that I wanted to show has to do with flood risk monitoring. I'm going to very quickly just show a quick video.
Conventional methods that we use in detail involve setting fixed control points around the island. We were able to do several around the hospital, around the Copra warehouse, at the airport, usually places that are permanent fixtures in the island topography, like a concrete slab or something like this that is going to stay in place for a long, long time. And determining their relative elevation to sea level. And we'll wind up creating an elevation model with literally 1,000 or more photos of the entire island, and then stitching those photos together and using some very common stereogrammetry techniques that creating a model or a three-dimensional image of the island. We are also really using non-traditional or non-conventional methods that, say, an anthropologist would often use. Interviewing elders about the flooding events in the past and trying to get a better sense of what existing knowledge is already with the community here. I guess a traditional ecological knowledge and a Western knowledge system coming together and forming the methods that we are employing to understand flood risk in the Marshall Islands.
Thank you everyone for your time and patience as I work through this presentation. Thank you everyone.
It was great. Thank you very much, Mark. Terrific to actually see people working on the ground. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions that come in the Q&A to the work that you're doing there, because it looks as if it's very innovative and exciting. Next up, we've got Meg Parsons. Meg is from Aotearoa, New Zealand. She is Ngāpuhi and Lebanese and Pākehā, European. She's a historical geographer whose research examines how Indigenous communities understand and respond to environmental change. Meg is also a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland and a contributing author to the 6th assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'm sorry, I'm really tongue-tied today. Anyway, Meg, kia ora, welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Kia ora, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on which this meeting or conference is taking place, even if it's virtually. As Christine said, I'm Ngāpuhi, but I am currently sitting in the Rauhi, the traditional lands of Ngāti Whātua within Tamariki Makaurau in Auckland. And I'm actually going to be presenting about another group, Rauhi. I'm going to be talking about the Waipa River, which is the main sort of tributary for the Waikato River. And it's within the Rauhi of several different tribal groups, Tainui, Waikato Tainui, and Ngāti Manuhoto. And I did my undergraduate degree at Waikato University and also went to high school in Hamilton. So I do have an affinity from the Waipa River. And also I did my PhD at Sydney University, so there is links there as well. So I entitled this Decolonising Climate Change Adaptation, but really I think in order to understand climate change adaptation from an Indigenous experience and knowledge systems, we need to acknowledge the past, not in a dogmatic we're living in the past, but the ways in which the past influences the current situation and futures. You know, and the ways in which climate change is often represented as a new, unprecedented phenomena which is sort of divorced from or separate from past actions, behaviours and experiences. But if we think of the climate change as one of the markers of the Anthropocene, well, I and a number of other sort of Indigenous scholars put forward the argument that we really should think about the Anthropocene as beginning with colonisation, specifically of the Americas, as the time period when which the Anthropocene began, and that climate change is intricately tied with this process of moving around the world, of colonising places, remaking landscapes, and industrialisation and the spread of global sort of economies, creation of industrial agriculture and industrial or urbanised ways of life. And I'm going to use the lens of just for talking about one sort of geo-feature, or in New Zealand we'd classify it as our awa, our tupuna, our ancestors. And this one river I'm going to be talking about is the Waipa River, which is the tributary to New Zealand's longest river, the Waipa, and flows from the King Country or Te Rohe Potai to the Waikato region on the central North Island. And it reaches the coast, the ocean, just south of Auckland. And as you can see, it flows through a lot of small towns, which, unless you're from New Zealand, you're not really familiar with. But this is sort of Otahonga, Tikuiti, is all the area of, and the rohe of Ngāti Maniopoto, and north of that is the area of the Kingitanga, or the King movement, which is led by Waikato Tainui. Now, the river is classified by Ngāti Maniopoto as their ancestor, and it is has a life force of its own. It is feminine, and that it's a treasure of all the iwi and hapu and whānau who live along and within those areas. It is also the home of all these sort of supernatural beings known as taniwha, who are sort of guardians and protectors. And the central one in the Waipa is Waiwaia. Now, prior to colonisation, the area was heavily forested and also contained large wetlands, some of the largest in New Zealand. And if we go on to what this meant for Maniopoto in particular, we first need to think about te ao Māori, the ways in which Māori understood the world and ways of doing things. And at the centre of this was notions of the holism and relational and kincentric sort of knowledge system, whereby everything, living and non-living, or human and more than human, are considered to be kin or relatives, which connects back to sort of the beginning of the world and the Sky Father and Earth Mother. And so what this meant is that the relationship that iwi had centred on this notion of reciprocal care and connectiveness. So even if they altered the environment, they did so in a way which was designed to maintain and enhance the life force of all things. So in this photo, which was taken prior to the colonisation of what's known as the King Country in about the 1860s or early 1870s, you can see a canoe, a man and some kids on a bridge. The area there is all manuka, and that has been burnt down because manuka was used for medicine, for clothing, for houses, for burning fires and everything. And so it was a key resource. So they used to locate it around all their villages. And here's one of the tributaries of the Waipa. And so at the heart of sort of Māori understandings of the world was this notion of kaitiakitanga, of guardianship, that you are a custodian of the environment and you're connected through your genealogy, your whakapapa, to the land, the water, the flora and fauna, taniwha and other beings. And the need to maintain sort of intergenerational access to and responsibilities for sort of future generations were key. And so what does this mean when we're thinking about adaptation? Firstly, we need to think that radical cumulative social ecological impacts were associated with colonisation, which is still ongoing. Despite the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed in 1840, their large-scale violence against people, against knowledge systems, but ways of life, but also the land and water, plants and animals occurred. And it occurred in this area with the invasion by the British military, supported by a few hundred Māori from opposing tribal groups in 1863. It was the largest military force outside British India at the time, and it ended up that we, time's up for me. So when I get it on to the next one. So what does this mean when thinking about adaptation? Well, what happened was, following colonisation, there was a large-scale removal of the environment, the Indigenous environment, and specifically the drainage of the wetlands, which produced a cascade of environmental degradation, most notably the creation of ongoing flood events, which continues on to the present day. The solution to this was large-scale creation of hard infrastructure, removal of all the vegetation, all the trees, wetlands, and creation of these large flood defences all along the Waipa River, which continue to be reinforced year by year into the present day. And alongside that, we've got the creation of algae blooms. Now, Māori have been continuously emphasising how, as they've been creating these flood levies and flood control schemes, they have contributed to Māori being dispossessed of their land, to homelessness, and the destruction of flora and fauna. The local people can no longer harvest food, medicine, or practice cultural rites along the river. And that this has negatively affected their spiritual and relationship with their taniwha. So emphasis from Māori perspectives has been on efforts to restore the wetlands and restore riverbanks. However, the local government and the central governments are continuing to reinforce the use of these hard structures in terms of rock, sort of flood levees or stock banks, as we call them. And now we're seeing increased drought events. They're intervening and producing the equivalent of the irrigated agriculture. And a lot of the interviewees I spoke to were fearful that the Waipa was going to end up like the Murray-Darling, because this is the level of intensification they're being sent. Now, all these flood and drought sort of strategies are being put under the climate change adaptation schemes and framed in very much the language and as modes of adapting to climate change. But for Māori, they're not seen as adaptation, but rather maladaptation. And they want transformation wherein there's recognition given to their knowledge and their sovereignty, and that co-governance and co-management arrangements which are in place are actually translated into actions, and that thinking about ecological restoration is healing, and that climate adaptation justice should focus on healing the relationships between Māori and Pākehā, between Māori and their traditional lands and waters, and between humans and the more than humans. And this requires the recognition of these multiple ontologies and knowledges. And also they emphasise the need to reframe flooding as a disaster, that flooding isn't a disaster for iwi, that it brings life, fertility and eels, tuna, to them, and that they need to make room for flooding and reconceive what is a disaster in the terms and how to adapt to climate change in more holistic manners. So I'll leave it there. Sorry for going over time.
It's wonderful, Meg. Thank you very much. I suspect now that you can see my face again. Okay, so thank you, Meg. That's wonderful. All sorts of questions come to mind around the use of Mātauranga Māori knowledge and Māori knowledge systems in making sure that there is a just transition through this process of adaptation, or adaptation is done justly, as it were. Anyway, I'll think about that in a minute. We now, I'm getting a bit flustered because we're running out of time. I now want to introduce to Dr. Tammy Tabe, who is a lecturer at the University of the South Pacific. Her research interests involve fisheries management, ecosystem-based adaptation, gender, historical relocation and displacement of Pacific people, identity and diaspora, and the climate change migration and displacement. Just bear with Tammy. Tammy is not feeling particularly well today, so we thank her for making a space for us despite her discomfort. So thank you very much, Tammy, and over to you.
Thank you, Christine, and Bula Vinaka, everyone from Fiji, based in Suva at the moment, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I'll build on what Mark and Meg previously talked about in relation to climate change adaptation. I think Mark highlighted a lot of important things, especially in terms of integrating Western scientific knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge for the purpose of advancing adaptation. And this is very essential in the Pacific context. And I know Meg just talked about the Indigenous way of knowing and relating to the environment in terms of adaptation. So I want to talk about today, I guess, one of the key areas that I've been working on in terms of my research, as well as work in climate change adaptation here in the Pacific. Looking at past relocations and how they inform present and future climate change adaptation, especially for communities that have been heavily affected by climate change impacts, specifically sea level rise, and may be subject to relocation in the future. So I wanted to use an example of a community that I work with and how they have been able to adapt in their new environment, and how this experience can perhaps inform conversations and discussions about climate change adaptation for communities that might be subject to relocation in the future, and especially policymakers that might be part of this panel today. Like Meg mentioned, that it's so important to learn from the past, and the past has been essentially used, especially by a lot of researchers and policymakers, to inform decisions that we currently have been developing, so that they do not only inform the current situations in terms of addressing climate change issues, but also for the future purposes as well. So I just want to talk about the Gilbertese community in which my family comes from. In the late 1950s and 60s, they were relocated from what today is called Kiribati. Back in the day, it was called Gilbert Island. So this group of people were not relocated directly from the Gilbert Islands. I'll refer to it as Kiribati. To the Solomon Islands directly. So they were relocated first to the Phoenix Islands, and the Phoenix Islands is also part of Kiribati. So initially they were relocated at the end of 1930s before they were relocated to the Solomon Islands. So you can see sort of like the way people have been moved or displaced originally from their home islands to a place where it's still within their territories, and how has that affected sort of like their way of lives. And then later on, we're relocated from their territories to someplace else that's a completely foreign land to them. So I'm just going to focus on the second relocation, which is to the Solomon Islands. And I'm not going to go into details about it because of time, but I just want to sort of present like the relocation in terms of moving a group of Atoll people from Kiribati to a Melanesian society in the Solomon Islands. And you can see and perhaps imagine the differences in terms of the environment, the cultural setting, but also the way of life. So initially when the Gilbertese arrived in the Solomon Islands, they were pretty overwhelmed with the environmental setting. It wasn't their choice to move, they were just following orders. And so they had a lot of challenges when they first settled on the island they call Wagina, and that's where my family currently lives. And that's where we would refer as to where we come from in the Solomon Islands. So this island was basically forested, highly vegetated, and it's very different from what an atoll island looks like. So there were several challenges that they encountered when they first settled on the island. There wasn't a place where they could be absorbed easily and sort of like start living out their lives. They had to really come and reestablish themselves as a community. And that wasn't easy. It took time, it took years. It took several loss in terms of lives, in terms of also relationships. So I'm just gonna talk about some of the main key challenges that they faced and perhaps how they have been able to adapt and become more integrated into the Solomon Island society. So one of the key challenges that they face is, of course, the environmental setting, because as opposed to an atoll island, Wagina in the Solomon Islands is covered in forest, more vegetated. There's rivers that they're not familiar with. So there was a lot of sense of overwhelm. There was a lot of, they were mostly overwhelmed and perhaps like shocked by the kind of environment they've been placed in. And the fact that they're atoll people, they could not really relate to the environment in which, how are they supposed to live in this area that is not really an atoll, that is not sand all around, that does not really have coconut trees, but has forest and elevated hills and rivers and other resources and ecosystems that they wouldn't find on atoll islands. And one of the other issues that they face is diseases. So they're not exposed to mosquitoes, and that was one of the major issues that they faced on the island, and that resulted in a lot of death. And they started to think like, why were we relocated here? Are we being exiled to die? And so there was a lot of those kind of thoughts. They had to adjust to the lifestyle because they do not speak Pidgin, or they cannot communicate in the Solomon Islands dialect. So that was one of the major issues for them, really expressing the challenges that they faced as a group of people in a new environment. But despite all of those challenges in terms of trying to reestablish themselves as a group of people, it has taken like over about 60 years now since they've lived in the Solomon Islands. And over that period, they've slowly become integrated into the Solomon Island society, and it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy trying to maintain themselves as a group of Gilbertese people. Initially, at first, there was no no effort in trying to integrate into the Solomon Island society, because they believe that if they start integrating into the Solomon Island society, they're going to lose their identity as Gilbertese people. However, they saw that by having enclave Gilbertese communities in the Solomon Islands, and for example, the one on Wagina, it doesn't really help them in terms of adapting into that new environment. And so I remember when I was growing up little, there was sort of like, oh, you can't intermarry into another cultural community because we need to intermarry within the Gilbertese community so that we can maintain relationships. And I think that's based on the understanding that relations and kinship ties is really important, but for a relocated community in a new environment, they have to think beyond just maintaining kinship ties and relations. They have to think that we're in a new environment. What can we do to survive or to thrive as a community? So I remember that elders at the time started encouraging young people to intermarry into other cultural communities. And this is because as a relocated community, there was no sense of ownership. There was no ownership of the land. There were no rights in terms of fishing rights, land rights. So that was one of the ways in which they see as in terms of adapting or becoming more integrated into the community by intermarrying. The other second thing that they encourage in order for the people to adapt is to reconstruct their relationship with the environment. So as atoll people, their strength lies in the sea. And so what can they do in a new environment like that is to reestablish that relationship, the same relationship they have with the ocean as they do back in the atolls in their new home. And that's one of the strengths that the Gilbertese people have. And that has sort of like sustained them as a Gilbertese people by really nurturing that relationship that they have with the with the ocean, but also really surviving off the ocean. And that sort of relationship has allowed them to sort of maintain the identity as Gilbertese, not really as, oh, we really wanted to become Solomon Islanders, but in that foreign land, they still were able to maintain the identity as Gilbertese people. There are other factors that also influence the way in which they adapt to the environment, beside the two main ones that I've mentioned. But because of time, I'm going to stop here, and I think Christine can raise some of the questions that can allow us to unpack some of the things that we've talked about. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you very much, Tammy. That was wonderful. Okay, so three really, I think both reflective and at the same time very provocative presentations. And what I'm sitting with here are a couple of things that I would like you to talk to. The first one is I'm reflecting on an essay by Kyle Powers-White from, I think it was about 2018, when he talked about his ancestors' déjà vu. And in Kyle, incidentally, if you don't know, is an Anishinaabe man from Turtle Island, from North America, particularly from the Great Lakes area in North America. And he talked about, in that essay, he talks about the fact that when we talk about climate change, we talk about apocalypse. We think that we're entering an apocalyptical future. And his statement is, well, actually, now is my ancestors' apocalypse. So the now that we are present to is what his ancestors would have viewed as apocalyptic. And I think each of you have spoken in a way to that concept of the apocalypse being present now because of the dislocation of culture, perhaps less in your case, Mark, and certainly it came through strongly in Tabe and Meg's presentations. So I wonder if you have any responses to that idea of the present actually being the apocalypse, and that this is not something that we can move off into the future. It's my first thought. And the second thought comes from a provocation that Mark gave before we started this conversation, which was around the idea of human rights. And we think of human rights as being a means through which we can protect each other. That we have Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we have separately the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Structures that are international and in theory should protect everybody. The problem with the notion of human rights, and this is something that Hannah Arendt noted too at the end of World War II, is that the people who implement human rights are the governments on national territories. And if those governments either choose not to do that, or if the peoples are dislocated from their government, there is no structure to protect their human rights. So what I'd like to do is open the floor for you each to have a couple of minutes to respond to either or both of those notions. And perhaps we can just do it in order again. If we start with you, Mark, and then move to Meg and Tammy. So I'll leave you to just to negotiate that with yourselves, starting with Mark, and when Mark finishes, Meg, if you'd like to join in, and then follow that with Tammy. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Christine. I'm just going to share a screen here that I think kind of has been very influential for me, as I did earlier with the poetry that was written, and kind of helps me make, not touch of the aspects of what I often address using sort of or legal arguments, or just common asset management best practices. That's my training so far. But looking back at my Pacific Island history roots and understanding my own family's history and migratory path, on my ancestry there, my father's side goes back to Germany, Norway. I think we are recognizable to each other in many ways that sometimes doesn't seem apparent at first. But one of those recognizable points of references is this pyramid that Maslow, made famous, and I think is kind of at the heart of a lot of the human rights conventions today. At this very early stage in making the connection between human rights and climate change frameworks at the United Nations level, personally, I've found it very helpful to focus on the bottom of the pyramid, because there's a lot of commonality and agreement, recognition of each other's basic needs. And so, looking at the second question, Christine, although it is very difficult to litigate and enforce the human rights conventions in someone else's country where the rights are being violated, or in your own, and have someone else, another country, speak on your behalf as the aggrieved party. I think that the correct term is extra jurisdiction. Although that is very difficult in the Human Rights Convention today, I think what I look at is common reference points. It's still a very powerful approach, human rights-based approaches to climate change adaptation. It's still very powerful because what we're talking about in terms of the hazard risks that are being monitored, as I was described earlier, and made evident as much as possible in universally recognized scientific terms. You know, that's kind of how climate change is understood, is through climate science. You know, if that's the tool set and the skill set that we need to learn, let's learn it, and let's advocate for our basic needs based on those things. So it's kind of like this very round, I guess, circular logic in terms of how do you make the human rights and the climate change frameworks integrated. I think there's just already quite a bit of recognizable relationships there. Thank you.
Yes. So I think also Wyatt's work has really been influential in sort of challenging me to actually go back to my humanities and social science roots. I came in with a background in Indigenous studies and historical geography, and specifically Indigenous public health histories within Australia and then in Aotearoa. And then I came into climate change adaptation, and actually John Barnett was sort of my mentor when I was doing my postdoc. And because of being surrounded by all these scientists, I sort of felt like I had to perform in a way that was expected. And I didn't know how to reconcile all my training within Indigenous studies and feminist geographies and everything within the sort of overwhelmingly sort of Western sort of scientific way of knowing and being, and impacts assessments and vulnerability assessment, all these sort of things. And I grappled on grasps on traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous knowledge when I was doing work with Indigenous communities in Australia, because it was something I could actually understand, which didn't things. But even then, I wasn't fully grasping and taking and reflecting critically of my own role as a researcher, but also my experiences and those of others. And I realised when I was talking to people about Indigenous knowledge or climate change, whether it be the Murrung people in the Kimberley, whether it Torres Strait Islanders, whether it was my own hapu back in New Zealand, we all came back to telling stories and histories about our own experiences and the continuing sort of legacies and realities of unequal power relations, whether it be institutional racism or the lack of being able to speak our languages fluently or do harvests of food that our grandparents did, or those sort of things. And so it made me think about climate change as this, rather than this new thing, it's part of this ongoing process. And at the moment, so much of the adaptation is focused on resilience, of maintaining the status quo of that, the institutional arrangements, the economies and the structures and the power relations remain unchecked. And one of the questions was about the barriers to adaptation in New Zealand. Well, the main barriers we've got recognition of Indigenous rights in terms of various treaty settlements and even co-governance and co-management arrangements like they've got for the Waipa River, but they don't have any power. They don't necessarily have enough money, and the government still does not have to, they only have to consult with them, but Māori are still treated as stakeholders, not as treaty partners, not as equal. And so the government, whether it's central or local government, often discusses issues to do with legislation or management or governance over the river, over land, over climate change, the emissions trading scheme, at the last minute, and will give a couple of weeks for the whole of Māoridom to respond to the government's legislation. And so they've already written the legislation or passed the planning. And so consequently, even if we've got rights recognised, it's still, as Mark said and Christine said, recognised by the government, but it's not recognition of sovereignty or self-determination or our responsibilities as kaitiaki to guardianship. And so within Māoridom, we're often talking shift from rights to thinking about responsibilities, and that all New Zealanders should think about their responsibilities to caring for our land, our water, our air, and for future generations. And I've probably stopped there. Pass it on to Tammy.
Thanks very much, Meg. Tammy?
Hi, I'll be short. Yeah, that's really interesting whenever it comes to human rights discussion. I think from my perspective and my work, over the past years, I saw that I became lost in the conversation of climate change adaptation. And I started to question, because I feel like we have been considered vulnerable not only to climate change, but I think if you're looking from a scholarly perspective, we've also become vulnerable to the global framing and discourse about climate change in the Pacific Islands, how vulnerable Pacific Island countries are. And so there's a lot of, conversations around, we need to have more voices. We need to sort of like advocate for human rights, but it's really like, if you look at it, like, our voices were taken away, our rights were taken away, and now we're trying to fight for them again, and so for me as a Pacific Islander, it really allows me to sort of examine and reevaluate my role in this space and how I can contribute towards empowering more positivity into conversations, especially really asking the hard questions, because the Pacific Islanders are very good at just accepting things. And it's just the way we are. We don't really sort of like come out in contradiction to what people are saying. We just accept them. So I'm trying to, really start asking questions, important questions that might be difficult to ask sometimes in spaces like this, in spaces where there's more authoritative figures. But I thought that by asking questions, that could really pave a way for a more sort of like in-depth conversation around sensitive issues that are dear to Pacific Islanders. Yes, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Tammy. All right, I think we have time only for one question only. We're really running very close to the end. But what I'm going to try and do is bring two questions together. So really, the question that I'm kind of crafting here is around one that asks whether adaptation is possible for migrating populations. So how do we, I guess part of the question here is, how do you maintain culture? How do you maintain original practices within the context of migration? And I get, without distressing people too much, without the loss of both physical and mental health and well-being. This relates really to all three conversations in a sense, very directly to your situation, Tammy, but Mark, in a sense to you, to your interests around this, Maslow's hierarchy and basic needs, and the needs that come from land to feed culture and to feed well-being. And Meg, it relates in Aotearoa to not so much migration, but to the loss of control over the landscape. That you're sort of taken out of the rohe, not physically, but the rohe is taken out of you because it's been completely changed, as it were?
I think one of the things that sort of we're grappling with is thinking about what it means for areas which are a significant portion of Māori live outside their rohe. So for the South Island, Ngāi Tahu, about 95% of them live outside that area. And so they still have the ability to make decisions about their area through sort of the tribal governance structures, but they're not living there or seeing the damage to their rohe and the changes. And so one of the things different iwi groups are grappling with, as well as all the Pacifica people living in New Zealand, is the ways in which, how do you plan for and how do you maintain connections with places which are physically you're removed from, but also there could be irreversible damage, and that our children and our grandchildren may never know the physical landscapes. And so one of the things is thinking about, they've talked about adaptation pathways or those sort of things, but acts of envisioning change and what change will be like, and getting even stuff of preserving Indigenous knowledge and places, what it looks like now, what it looked like historically, and also getting young people out sort of back to country trips, the equivalent of going to physical places to see it now. And so with cameras and videos and social media to try and form a sort of an online collective. So, and tell stories about these places. Because as we know from Indigenous knowledges, those storytelling and maintaining an intergenerational transfer of knowledge is essential to identity, but also resilient in terms of well-being and sense of self, which is key to adaptation, I think, from an Indigenous perspective, at least from a Māori perspective.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Tammy. Yes, Tammy.
Thanks, Christine. I think in the context of relocated communities, from my experience, in the Pacific, Pacific Islanders are part of the land, they embody the land. And so when they leave, they're an extension of the land. So in the context of relocated communities, using the example of the Gilbertese in the Solomon Islands, they had to reestablish, reconstruct themselves in that society. Mm-hmm. They're an extension of their land, although they've lost everything or they've lost their homeland, they were able to reconstruct their relationship with the environment, reestablish social and cultural elements that makes a Gilbertese community sort of like a Gilbertese rather than a Solomon Island community. And so that creating that setting or establishing that environment allows them to kind of thrive as a people, because I think recreating that environment allows them to observe their cultures in terms of traditions, dances, singing, as well as language. And so I guess for me, one of the things is like the reestablishment, reconstruction of identity can come from sort of like reestablishing of social capital and the relationship between people as well. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Tammy. And Mark last.
Yeah, I really appreciate those two responses, and it's very similar to what I've been thinking. I would just add the tools and the types of I guess data collecting or documentary or gathering of stories and all these different ways of informing adaptation, all that knowledge, data, information that is being aggregated. In my mind, especially because I come from an atoll country, is invaluable to my children, my grandchildren, who may not have the ability to live in these places that I do. You know, these archives of the places and the stories and the, you know, as much as possible, as much as technology can make possible. The 5 sensory experiences, you know, 6 sensory experiences of time and place. It does seem a little bit science fiction, but I answered one of the questions that was presented here. You know, how do you use citizen science to monitor groundwater? You know, do you teach people how to use the complicated equipments? Well, that's a great question, and it takes a lot of time to be a teacher, to get to a point where you can be a teacher. And there are so many ecosystem services that have cultural significance, whether it be the fish that is seasonal, or the breadfruit that is also seasonal. All these ecosystem services, these expressions of skill to live on an atoll, these expressions of, some would say culture, but really it's just survival in these places. In many cases, you know, culture serves a very important role in surviving in these atolls. These basic needs are our culture. So the ability to document these and keep them close in our hearts and minds, with the ability of, with the support of
Mark, I'm going to have to interject there. We've come to time. Thank you very much for that. Just to wrap up, I'd like to thank Mark and Meg and Tammy for really insightful and, more importantly, really hopeful and really uplifting conversation here this afternoon. I think that each of you have demonstrated, particularly in that last conversation, ways in which story can be maintained, and the way that we can use modern technology to keep story, to keep culture, and to keep our lands alive and vibrant. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the audience and the wonderful questions that you sent in. I'm sorry we ran a little bit over time. Thank you, folks, and bye.